Hi, my name is Chik, a rising senior at UC Berkeley. My research paper examines the disparities between the timeline and number of Medal of Honor awarded to Japanese American soldiers and African American soldiers at the end of World War II. There were 33,000 Japanese American soldiers and more than 2.5 African American soldiers serving in the US military. Immediately after the war, however, Japanese American soldiers were highly praised and earned many more awards for their service than African American soldiers. No medals of honor were given to African American soldiers decades after the war, despite their remarkable service records. Japanese American soldiers faced fewer negative stereotypes even after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and were permitted to serve in a more prominent combat position, which earned them these highly honored distinctions and awards. After the war, three factors help account for the more positive treatment toward Japanese American soldiers. First, the US government took away Japanese American property and put West Coast Japanese American families into internment camps. Second, the federal government could acknowledge the service of Japanese American soldiers because most of them came from Hawaii, which was still an American territory at the time. Third, Asian Americans did not participate in race riots during the war and were not actively fighting for their civil rights like African American soldiers. Therefore, there was less fear among government officials that Asian Americans would be encouraged after receiving the medals to denounce white dominations on the mainland. At the height of the Jim Crow segregation era, African Americans were seen by white officers as being unfit for the military service. Black soldiers were discriminated against in the military and had to fight hard to get into combat roles. As black soldiers were participating in important warfare battles abroad, African Americans at home were fighting against white supremacy. For example, in the early 1940s, Black civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph threatened to organize a march in Washington, while race riots erupted in Detroit and Harlem. After African American soldiers came back home after World War II, the veterans added strength to the civil rights battle against white supremacy and Jim Crow segregation. White military officials feared that any action they took would empower the African American community. For example, by recognizing the bravery of black soldiers, would add fuel to the movement against conservative politicians and a white control government. At the same time, any commemorations of African American contributions could be used as propaganda by ambitious white conservatives to denounce white liberal favorisms toward African Americans. The story of Japanese veterans was dramatically different. After World War II, Japanese Americans gained great power as Hawaii became the 51st state. Japanese Americans were making their way into prominent positions that had previously been reserved for the white people. Japanese Americans were even permitted to become US senators, like Daniel Inouye. After a long fight for civil rights, African Americans won some improvements in their social status. For example, the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education court case officially ended Jim Crow segregation. However, no effort was made to investigate the treatment of African American soldiers in World War II. It took an official Army report from the Department of Defense to prove that African Americans indeed face racial bias in the military records. It would take 5 more decades to motivate an American president to finally honor those African American soldiers for their service in World War II. This is regrettably consistent with America's historical failure to sufficiently remedy the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow segregations, and remain an important lesson for those committed to social and economic justice.